Hello and welcome back to Swan Signal Live. Thanks so much for joining us today. We've got a great show. We're going to focus on Bitcoin mining. We've got two all-stars from two of the biggest Bitcoin mining companies in the world. This is going to be a great conversation. A couple words about Swan before we dive in. A lot of you don't know this, and we need to do a better job about marketing this, which is why I'm talking about it right now. Swan is international. We are available in just about every country in the world. There's a couple dozen that we can't operate in due to US laws, but everyone else, you can set up an account at Swan. Just go to swan.com and we can serve you. You can transfer money into your Swan account with bank wires, and we would love to serve you. We've got a team now that can help you with any questions that you have, and we're excited to be global. You should also check out the Bitcoin Canon. Of course, Swan is dedicated to Bitcoin education. We want to create 10 million new Bitcoiners, not just Bitcoiners, people who are holding Bitcoin, but people who truly understand what's going on here. We believe that if we can do that, we can really push forward the adoption of Bitcoin by creating a vocal kind of minority of people to talk about Bitcoin, to advocate for Bitcoin in the United States and beyond. So we think that's really important. You can check out the Bitcoin Canon. This is a new education project that we put together where we've decided that we realized there's so much Bitcoin education content out there. It's really blown up and just flourished over the past few years, both in quantity and quality. And so we decided that we really just need to apply some curation on top of it. So we've recruited some of the best Bitcoin minds in the space to create rabbit holes on various topics, and they will go and hand pick what they think is the best content for that particular topic, and they'll create a little video introducing you to their rabbit hole and little summaries of each piece on why that piece is important to understand. So we've got all kinds of different various media in there, writing and podcasts and videos and all of that. It's amazing. Check it out at swanbitcoin.com/canon or swan.com/canon as it is now. We've procured that domain, which is really exciting. Swan.com/canon. We will be moving to Twitter Spaces at the end of this show. So we'll do the live video portion here. This audio is going into Spaces right now. You can find that space at Swan Bitcoin on Twitter or just at the top of your Twitter app. And we'll be moving to Spaces after this for a live Q&A with our two guests. And then I will bring them up right now. We have Juri from from Foundry Digital, I think is the full name, which has running the largest Bitcoin mining pool in the world now, which is really exciting. He is the head of mining at Foundry Digital. He's previously the director of Bitcoin mining at Fidelity. And we also have Amanda Fabiano, who is the head of mining at Galaxy Digital now. And she also was the director of Bitcoin mining at Fidelity before. So these two know each other very well and have worked in the space for a long time. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, very excited to have you. So I'm going to start with an issue that came up. It's been around for a long time, obviously, and it's being talked about in politics. And today, in the executive order that Biden released about cryptocurrencies, it was mentioned again. So the bit where this was mentioned, you said the United States must maintain technological leadership in this rapidly growing space, supporting innovation while mitigating the risks for consumers, businesses, the broader financial system, and the climate. So all of it's pretty bullish until you get to that last bit, the climate. And in my mind, this climate FUD is really the ultimate FUD boss for Bitcoin. It does not seem to go away. And we recently also had a congressional hearing called Cleaning Up Cryptocurrency. This one, it's so hard. It's an example of Brandolini's law, that idea that, it's difficult to debunk false or misleading information, like exponentially harder to do that than it is to sort of put out there. So I'll start with you, Juri. As an industry, what are we doing right now, and what should we do more of in order to combat this intractable narrative?
Yeah, straight in the hard questions.
Yeah, let's go.
I think we do need to engage more, and that is what we are trying to do. We think at Foundry that a lot of commentary and areas that you are hearing from regulators or policymakers, that they do stem from not understanding this space and them reading an article or two, some kind of FUD, and crafting their narrative. So I don't think they're all coming from a necessarily malice or a bad place. It's just misinformation, and we do need to spend time, engage, inform, and educate them, and engage in a dialogue. And so what what we have done at Foundry, and we are based in New York. We're based in upstate New York in Rochester, arguably the most non not a friendly state to our industry, starting from bit license and definitely around mining as well. And so we that's our home, and this is where we are spending a lot of efforts in New York State specifically. We have recently hired director of public policy, who is an absolute rock star, and really as a push of our efforts to engage more with policymakers. We work with various advocacy groups. We through DCG, we have been as a group supporting various advocacy group for some time, but we also felt that there's a need to focus a little bit more about proof of work and mining specifically. So Foundry has recently joined the Blockchain Association. We have joined the SET Center, and we will continue to support a lot of different efforts in the space to try to bring our voice, the mining industry's voice, to the table.
Yeah, I saw that I was on that first SAT Center call, which is sort of an answer to Coin Center as a public policy advocacy group, a Bitcoin-only version of Coin Center. And I'm really excited that Swan is also a part of it. I think it's very important. Excited to hear that there's a public policy staff now at Foundry. That's really important as well. I know Galaxy has joined the Bitcoin Mining Council, and another kind of similar group that's dedicated to fighting this FUD. Amanda, your comments.
Yeah, so I think that this has been a topic of conversation that has been quite annoying for much longer than the past year. So Juri and I had worked together at Fidelity, like you said, and back in 2019, we put on a mining event basically to talk about mining because no one was talking about it. And the only headlines were like, Bitcoin mining is going to consume all of the world's energy by 2022, right? Which is ridiculous and still not real. So I think that narrative has been around for a while, and there wasn't really a lot of larger groups like combating the narrative. But now that we have an influx of, large public mining companies in the US, that there's a reason for that narrative to be shifted, right? Like it's important for their businesses to succeed. So there's more people stepping up to the plate and saying like, hey, this is actually really false. The Bitcoin Mining Council, I know there was a lot of strife around it when it first came out, but it's done exactly what we wanted it to do, which was people can join it, you can share your energy mix, and it shows that like the data shows that Bitcoin mining is using more sustainable energy sources than any other industry. So there's something to be said with like correct data. And I think that has been something that has come out over the past year, which we didn't have before. It's like, Juri, you have, the Foundry map, right? Where you show like, here's the distributed location of all of our miners, right? And you could kind of back into what is the general breakdown of energy, right? From those locations. You have the Mining Council, which does that. You had the report that Nick Carter and NIDIG put out last year. You have, a lot of different sources of data now that is combating this FUD. And now it's just using that and like teaching the regulators the right narrative, right? Because they just see things on Newsweek and public, like Wall Street Journal and Main Street media that just doesn't get it. And it's our responsibility to teach them the right way. And I think this is something that, within the mining community, people disagree on. And I think it's probably good that we disagree on it because there's a lot of different strategies. But I think that you have to engage or else they're going to have the wrong narrative. The opposite is that you have people like groups like Ripple, right, that are like sponsoring different types of, engagements that kind of shit on proof of work to pump their own bags. So I think it's important for us, and as like industry leaders, we have to engage or else the narrative is just going to be completely shifted from what's not real.
Today I learned that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to build on it because that's a good point that Amanda mentioned, is because Bitcoin is decentralized, there's no we don't know who Satoshi is, and he's not publicly present. Otherwise, he would be in the congressional hearings talking about the network, right? There's no centralized company behind the protocol. And so, well, that's, one of Bitcoin's biggest value proposition, and why it's as important as it is, as big as it is. When it comes to this public discourse and countering some of these narratives, that is Bitcoin's problem, right? I do think that, going back to the education, I do think that regulators or policymakers, they're trying to understand this system, and their typical approach is, let me go to the centralized, industry group, and let me collect all the data. Let me interview the key people I need to interview to get to the source of truth. And you cannot do that in Bitcoin, right? It is the centralized network, and that's why it's valuable. And so through all these different efforts, like a Bitcoin Mining Council or Foundry USA Pool, we are in a position to maybe work with, obviously not every single miner in the industry, but try to aggregate some of the data while respecting the privacy of the underlying miners, to be able to publish some valuable data that would help understand what is actually going in the Bitcoin mining network. So I do think that all those different studies are valuable, and in fact, I think it's very, very good that there are different approaches coming to the same result. So I can speak to the Foundry study that we've done, where we analyzed or try to estimate the power consumption and energy mix from our customers, and we concluded that more than 70% of power consumed is generated from low carbon energy sources. And I believe that, Amanda, you probably have the most recent numbers, but at least as of Q3, it was upwards of 50-60% of the Mining Council found. And so I think it's really good that two independent studies are showing similar findings.
Juri tweeted recently that Bitcoin mining technologies have increased their energy efficiency 40,000% since 2009. Can you talk about that trend a little bit and where it's heading now?
Oh, did I tweet or retweet? I
Retweet.
Both still count, Juri.
Yeah. No, so I think that the specific number would just be showing how the efficiency of ASIC chips that are converting energy or electricity into a hash and then later into Bitcoin, how much more efficient they got. And obviously, since the inception of ASICs, when we went from CPUs and GPUs to ASICs, it was orders and orders of magnitudes of improvements in the efficiency, and you can measure the efficiency unit of power that goes into the mining machine and unit of output that comes out measured in terahashes. And so that efficiency, that rate has been improving by many folds. And right now we are seeing that the efficiency curve is plateauing slightly. There's still, every new miner is achieving a certain efficiency, but definitely not as much as it did in the past.
Amanda, your thoughts?
I would add there, like, it seems like, and Juri, we've talked about this multiple times before, but like in the past, miners, like, real competitive edge was really having the latest ASIC, right? Because there was so many efficiency gains at the beginning, and now there aren't that many because we're hitting up against Moore's law. And I think the really interesting part is going to be like innovations in the mine to get miners to that point where they can continue to use the machine that they have and leverage it longer term. So there's a lot of companies that we're looking at immersion cooling in like a capacity that was more research based. And now we see some of the larger miners like Riot and Argo saying, hey, we're going full speed ahead with immersion. And so that allows you to have like more lifespan of the actual machine. I think the other piece that kind of gets lost sometimes in translation, especially to regulators, and this is like a big topic on top of like the energy usage, is the e-waste, right? I've heard that quite a bit from people that don't understand the space. It's like, well, your goal is to get like the best machine, right? To get like the most hash. And yeah, like maybe that is true for some people, but I think there's also this like large secondary market that like is booming, right? So you can still buy S9s, which were made 5 years ago, and they still account for 28% of the network. So that whole narrative around like, well, miners are just going to like throw out the machines, right, that they have once the next machine comes available isn't really true. But I think that, the efficiency gains has been incredible. And super innovative, but I think we are getting to that like plateau point, and I think this will now switch to how are people using the machines to their advantage in a different way and being more innovative in their operational setup versus like just purchasing the next batch of machines.
Yeah, Amanda, you mentioned this secondary market, and I know Foundry has launched a secondary marketplace called Foundry X last year. And from my understanding, it's a marketplace where buyers and sellers can be paired together. So can you tell us a little bit more about the marketplace, why you all built it, how it helps the industry to kind of solve this e-waste problem, or at least mitigate it?
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, we launched Foundry X officially in December of last year. And the idea is that it would bring more transparency and trust in how units are being procured and sold. We have developed a network of 200 plus buyers and sellers that we can help match. That's the ideal state. Right now, it does operate more like a brokerage desk, and Foundry is in the middle of every deal, meaning we would be procuring machines, whether it's directly from manufacturers, selling from existing Foundry inventory, or from resellers, and selling them to whoever reaches out to us who needs machines. But it's really along those lines why even Foundry got started is to bring more capital efficiency and trust and transparency in the Bitcoin mining industry, which I think we have come a long way. But if you were in the industry even 5 years ago, it felt like an absolute wild west, and definitely before companies like Galaxy or Foundry got into this space. Amanda and I have many crazy funny stories trying to work on Bitcoin mining as Fidelity as early as, what was it, 15, 16, when it truly was a wild west.
Yeah, it was really funny trying to talk to like Fidelity to be like, hey, like we have to pay in Bitcoin for these invoices. If you don't pay for them right now, like the machines are going to go away. And like it was just like a hilarious conversation. I think that that's one of the reasons why I think places like Galaxy and Foundry were really appealing to us, Juri, right? Because like we were able to take away some of that red tape and still operate in a way that is like really institutional grade, right? Like I think we both recognize, and I don't want to speak for Juri, so tell me if I'm wrong, but we both recognize that mining was the foundational component of Bitcoin, and it needed to get better in order for like the adoption to happen. And so like we had been like working on this and like loving mining years ago when no one cared about it. Like it was always fascinating to me that we would go to places like, large events, and there would be not a single panel on mining. It was just like absolutely fascinating to me. And it has matured quite a bit with places like Galaxy and Foundry, right? Like now offering solutions like brokerage, right? And I think Ethan Vera from Luxor had a tweet that was like, or maybe it was Drew, that was like 2022 is going to be the year where everyone becomes a broker, right? And like Foundry has created like that amazing like website that like allows people to see it transparently. But I think a lot of people do brokering, right? And I think that that's like, that's been around for a while. And having the progression to what Juri and team has built has matured the industry a little bit, right? You don't have to go in a Telegram channel anymore and hope that the person isn't completely scamming you to buy machines on the secondary market. So there's, we have matured quite a bit. I know we still have a way to go, but it's been fun to be, part of the process to see like the beginning of like, our journey at least in it and see how much it's changed in 4 years.
Yeah, it's really cool that Fidelity adopted Bitcoin in such a way early on as just a massive financial services company. It's really cool to me, and it's great to see people coming out of Fidelity and moving to more dedicated public companies that are dedicated to Bitcoin mining. There's, I think now, I think you had tweeted it, Amanda, 16, maybe more at this point, publicly traded Bitcoin mining
at the beginning of last year,
NASDAQ.
there were 2 listed on NASDAQ. At the end of last year, there's 16 listed on NASDAQ, and I think the core then closed. I haven't followed who else has closed. So we're up to at least 17, which completely changes the landscape of how companies like Fidelity are looking at investing in the space.
Yeah, 8x growth.
It's so funny because I do remember having conversations back in the day from an asset management standpoint when someone wanted to get exposure through public markets to mining industry. You would buy Intel stock or something where the revenue that Intel had at the time from mining sector, it was selling GPUs. It was less than, I don't know, 1%, 0.5%, whatever it is. And right now that you have 16 plus publicly traded miners plus many other companies that are publicly traded and you could get exposure, it's absolutely amazing to see the transformation in just a short period of time.
I also thought it was pretty cool. Like, one of the things that Juri and I did was we worked internally on education. So similar to what you guys are doing here, right? With like packaging, like education for Bitcoin, like Juri and I did a lot of that. And for me, like that was like the journey of like learning about Bitcoin and then deciding like what area I wanted to focus on. So I think Fidelity is a great place to get that going. And I feel like it was like kind of glory years for us, right? So it was fun and it was painful at times trying to do like something very weird. It's such a large traditional like institution. But it was a great launch pad for sure and made a lifelong friend out of it. So I'm pretty happy.
Oh, and not to go down the memory lane, but we did mention on immersion, and I do have to say that Fidelity in a weird way was a pioneer in immersion cooling, and Amanda took the lead on that project where somehow she convinced Fidelity executives to actually put a submerged units in Fidelity's data center in the basement of the headquarters. And that was absolutely amazing that we managed to do that. And back in the day, obviously, it was extremely, extremely expensive, and it wasn't the way to mine, and it wasn't also the way that Fidelity mined. But like we said, definitely now technology has improved and costs have gone down, and many companies are going that route.
We told them two things. One, you could drink the fluid. And they believe that is true. I wouldn't suggest it, but you can drink it.
I thought it was mineral oil.
Yeah, it's like dielectric fluid. We did bring one miner there who did taste it. He is an oil and gas guy. I'm not going to call him out here, but he knows exactly who he is. Gotcha. The other thing that was hilarious, there was a fire at one point in the cafeteria, and everyone thought it was the mining in the basement. It wasn't. It was a salad bar, surprisingly. It was not like the immersion cooling mining, but we were the first people to get blamed for it.
Like miners typically do. For anything that happens, miners get blamed. And proof of work.
This is true. Yeah, the miners take a lot of the flack for the Bitcoin network. It's the main source of the FUD. Well, okay, this is great conversation because we're talking about like the convergence of Bitcoin mining on the United States over the past year. Really, the great hash rate migration happened. With Bitcoin miners coming from China to North America. It's one of the biggest stories of last year and one of the biggest stories in the history of Bitcoin, I would say. Foundry became the largest mining pool, and it's been incredible to watch. So what are some of the takeaways from this whole migration from the front row of watching all of this happen? We'll start with Amanda on this one.
I mean, I think that we've learned from a lot of different press releases from companies like with issues that building is actually very difficult, right? So like everyone comes out and says like, hey, I'm going to be the largest miner in the world. And luckily that narrative has kind of shifted a little bit, even though we still see that pop up sometimes. But, I think that the real thing has been like we've seen delays on sites, right? We've seen people say that they're going to have a larger capacity than they actually can produce. So I think, one thing that gets left out of mining is like building is actually very difficult and became even more difficult after COVID happened, right? With the delays in the supply chain. And no one expected the China ban, right? I don't think that, at least I didn't expect China to completely ban Bitcoin mining. But I think one of the things that I saw over the past year was Chinese miners, they were able to get up and running relatively quickly compared to like US. So I think that they expected to be able to come here and things be as quick as it was in China. And that's just not the case. That's not the case for, reasons with code, right? Like electrical code is a little bit different. Yuri and I had gone to a Chinese mine and we were a little bit shocked by the build versus like what we'd seen in America. So there's a little bit more diligence that's required for building in the US. And I also think that with, like I said, with the supply chain delays, it became even more difficult and timeframes got even more pushed out. So I think last year there was this like, oh my God, how am I ever going to get ASICs, right? The ASIC supply chain was backed up. And I think that that's kind of subsided this year, right? You'll see like in the secondary market, ASIC prices have begun to depress because there's an inflow of ASICs because everyone is delayed on building. So like the people that are focusing on building out their sites over the next year and like heads down focusing on that, I think will be in a really good shape by the end of this year.
I absolutely agree. I would just add from also just a very macro level that this bench showed how resilient Bitcoin is or Bitcoin mining is. We had China, who was at the time, I believe, 60-70% of the global hash rate, overnight banned Bitcoin pretty much. And we've had disruptions in the short term until the difficulty readjusted, but in a grand scheme, you could say that Bitcoin mining industry was totally unaffected. And so I think this is very telling. I think it's showcasing the resilience of Bitcoin network. And it also should give a warning to people that we should constantly strive to decentralize further hash rate across different jurisdictions. And on that note, all the miners in the United States, especially miners who were still plugged in, they had outsized profits and margins and returns because the hash rate dropped, and definitely more proportional in the price itself. But I don't think any true believers in Bitcoin and decentralization are happy or would be happy with the hash rate in the United States growing from now, I believe it's 30-40% to 50, 60, 70, 80. And while if I had to pick one country where the hash rate would be centralized, if that's the state that it has to be, of course I would pick United States, because I do like that it's a federated system. I think different states will have a totally different view on Bitcoin mining and will not all follow the same lead. But I do not want to see any single country having more than 40-50% of the global hash rate.
Yuri, that's a really good point. And we see that, right, coming in play. So like we think about like Texas, right, which I'm in right now, and it's like a great state for Bitcoin mining and it's adopting. And then there's New York, who's trying to, continue on with that moratorium, right? And so it is like we as Bitcoiners, we should want Bitcoin to be as decentralized as possible, right? But agree with you 100% that like it's very American of us to say this, but like if it has to be somewhere, like awesome that it's here, but it should be in places that like are going to be welcoming and engaging and part of the innovation. It was interesting. I didn't love when people were like, yes, like the majority is now in the US. It's like, well, that's like not kind of the point, right? Like it should be like completely decentralized.
And especially how it happened, right? We all kind of won, but I do feel very bad for Chinese miners. They're all entrepreneurs. Totally. They were running their facilities, and it must be devastating. Like I cannot even imagine imagine in the United States if a regulator tomorrow says you need to shut down all your equipment. Like it is extremely rewarding when you when you order your equipment, you wait many months, you build your facasilities, you plug them in. When you start hearing that,
you talk to 75 people at Fidelity, right?
Yeah, yep. Exactly. When you hear that sound of hashing, it's very rewarding, and just the fact, the idea that you would need to shut it down and look for a new home is devastating. So I definitely do feel bad for Chinese miners. I do think that they're probably the most entrepreneurial people in the world, and better than anyone, they very quickly started finding solutions, whether some still in China, some in Kazakhstan, Russia, all over the world. They're extremely entrepreneurial, and I think the reason why we saw such a quick recovery of hash rate is because Chinese are very entrepreneurial and solution-oriented people.
And they even were in China, right? Like they were shifting where they were every year. So they were going back and forth to
Right.
find that
Oh, yeah.
cheapest source of energy, right? So like it was just in them to be very like mobile
Yeah.
and you know, be able to like get scrappy with it, which is like what was the backbone of the mining industry before we had all of these large public miners in the US, right? So like I think that they deserve like way more credit, right, than I think that we've given them. But it is still like really difficult to pick up your stuff and move it somewhere else. And Juri, I think if I remember correctly, when we were first plugging in machines, we were so excited and we were calling it like, it's like the heartbeat of the network, right? Like you plug it in and it just like hums and you just like feel like the money being made and it feels like real good. But there is like, if you haven't plugged in a machine, like if there's just something that happens when you do it that is very, very cool. I think it is that anticipation, right? Because you're so excited, you get everything in line and then it's there and it's exciting.
That's very cool. Yeah, you can see it's kind of like the first time you spin up a node and you know you can see blocks coming in and syncing on the network and stuff. It might be
It's not as terrifying as self-custody, but you know.
that is a whole thing. We are not used to holding and being responsible for our own money. We're used to outsourcing that, and yeah, that's something to get your head around for sure. This conversation makes me think of Max Kaiser and Jason Lowry and some other people who talk about this. You know, there's many layers to Bitcoin's game theory, and on the mining level, there's this. I think it's already started. This, nations competing against each other for hash for hash on the network. You see that Bitcoin is already a global money. It's going to play an increasingly important role. I feel like we pulled forward like 10 years over the past, like the response to COVID and the Russian invasion has really sped things up on this game theory level. And so the idea is we'll have nations competing against one another. They'll see the United States getting 50% of the hash rate, and that will incentivize other countries to say, no, we're going to grab some of that so that we can, have a stake on the network. What do you all think about how this plays out? I'm sure you've thought about, as a business strategy, from a business strategy perspective, about the way the geopolitical sort of implications of hash and mining. Juri, you want to start on that one?
Yeah. So we're definitely seeing, and you can see that in the United States specifically, right, how different states are responding differently to Bitcoin mining. I do think that some of those incentives or openness to Bitcoin mining is coming for different reasons, and I think those reasons are also going to be developing over time. You have states like Texas that some of those values of liberty and freedom are part of the country, and they're very welcoming to anyone starting any entrepreneurial activity as long as it's legal, and mining is absolutely legal. So I think other states also just see it as a tax revenue base, more jobs, many other things, and that's where they're starting by saying, we have energy, you need energy, you're going to pay us for that energy, come on board, right? I think maybe the reasons that are going to develop over time, and obviously one is what the narrative Bitcoin miners are trying to explain, how Bitcoin miners are also very very beneficial to the grid and being integral part of the stabilizing the grid. I think more states have yet to realize that benefit, inviting miners, or in some cases maybe even subsidizing miners, or creating environment for miners where it makes sense for them to come, seeing that benefit. And I think the third phase would be what you alluded to, where states are recognizing the value of Bitcoin as an asset, Bitcoin as a decentralized asset, and realizing that they also want to be part of the network. They want to have hash rate in the state itself as a way of protecting Bitcoin, protecting citizens who hold Bitcoin, and so on. And I don't think many states are there yet on that level of thinking.
I guess this goes to like the point that we all love to say as Bitcoiners is like Bitcoin doesn't care, right? Like if you are a nation state mining Bitcoin, if you're an individual person in your backyard with a black box, right, from upstream data mining Bitcoin Bitcoin doesn't care really. And we saw that happen with the Chinese ban, right? So it gives me a little bit of hope that regardless of if, you know, nation state do try to adopt this as part of like their long-term strategy, which we've seen happening, right, in El Salvador too. That's great, but like overall, it shouldn't really affect how Bitcoin works, which is like ultimately the best game theory piece of Bitcoin is like it's still going to continue on. We're still going to use it how we want to. And it's still going to be for, you know, people in different areas that might need access to finance that like we are looking at it differently than them. So the beauty of Bitcoin is that you can use it however you want. And the beauty of mining Bitcoin is you can mine Bitcoin however you want, right? So whether it's like I said, an individual person or a nation state, I don't think it matters that much. Hot take there. I'm hungry, so.
I love it. Juri, we were talking about this a little bit before we went live about miner centralization, and a piece of that is centralization of the production of ASICs. And you know, there are a few that are really producing them. Of course, it was dominated by Bitmain for so long. There's a few more producers now, TSMC, Samsung, etc. We've heard from Square, I guess Block, that they are going to start producing some ASICs. Blockstream recently bought an ASIC manufacturer. So we're starting to see some moves to decentralize the space, at least a little bit. Why is that important, Juri? And what do you see moving forward? Are we going to get even more chip manufacturers based in the United States? Do you see other parts of the world spinning up foundries?
Yeah, great question. And I would separate the stack or the process of making chips at the fab level, and then what we call manufacturers, which could entail anything from actually designing the chip that's being printed and then assembling the unit into the final product. And I do think that greater centralization is at a chip fabrication level. And that is not just the case for Bitcoin ASIC chips. I think that generally the world is very centralized in a couple of fabs that are making all kinds of semiconductor chips that we use in any electronics that we have, right? And I think first point there is that with COVID, with even with the war on Russia and Ukraine, I think that the world is realizing that maybe even for national security issues, there is need to bringing some of those functions, so to speak, in-house, right? And the United States has been taking some of those actions. So that's one point on the fab level, and in the Bitcoin mining space, the biggest fabs are TSMC and Samsung, like you said, and the Chinese MIC is, I believe, the third largest. Then we get into the manufacturing decentralization, or the number of different manufacturers that we have, and this is where I would, you would put Bitmain and MicroBT and Canaan and Bitfury and many others in that camp, with Bitmain and MicroBT having the largest market share. And so if I look at that space, it's definitely still very centralized. And I think it's good for the industry to have new entrants come into the space. And with simple economics 101, more competition is in the end gonna reduce prices, improve processes, bring efficiencies, and ultimately it's better for the consumer, in this case for Bitcoin miner, and therefore better for Bitcoin mining industry and the ecosystem. So finally, I think the reason why we have not seen many entrants or disruptors to Bitmain and MicroBT historically is because it's very expensive and capital expensive business. And not to say that there aren't great chip manufacturers or designers around the world, right? It's just the pace at which new chips are coming online were at 18 or so months. And so if you were to get into this game, you would have to count, your first chip, you're still learning. Your first chip is not going to be the market leader. So you need to count that by your second or third try, which could take a couple of years. Only then you will be competitive on the market. and being able to collect some fruits of your labor. And in a very for startups, that's very expensive. For large companies like Intel and others, maybe the ecosystem was too small at a time and it was actually not meaningful for them. And I think we're now reaching the point where the pace of innovation or efficiency improvement is slowing down, and that means that the new chip from Bitmain or the new chip from MicroBT is gonna be slowing down how much better it is as compared to the last generation. And what that's slowing down enables is for others to catch up. And I do expect that in the coming years we're going to see, thankfully, a lot more manufacturers in this space.
So a few things there to react to. One, I think, Juri, you brought up a really interesting point about the national security issue for bringing chips in-house. And like just going to like a very high macro level, it's really interesting how the two things that are brought up with recent news is energy and chips, right? Which are like the foundation to creating like a good Bitcoin mining facility or company. So it's just, it goes back to like the fundamentals of like what you need like to be prosperous, and like, energy and some types of chips are now in every single thing that we use. So I want to break down like the ASIC manufacturing industry, because you bring up a good point, right? It's very centralized, starting to get less centralized. There's two main foundries that are currently producing chips at scale. There's TSMC and Samsung. TSMC works with Bitmain mainly, and Samsung works with MicroBT. So those are like the two largest ASIC manufacturers, right? They are based in different locations, which is generally good for us. So TSMC is obviously based in Taiwan. Samsung is based in Korea. From like a geopolitical perspective, that is something that I think of, just because if something was to happen in Taiwan, right, you also now can have machines or just chips specifically from Korea. Those two foundries, like Juri was saying, produce chips not just for Bitcoin mining, but for all of the things that we know, right? Your car, your cell phone, your computer, everything that you touch, your smart TV, your smart phone, right? Like everything is created there. And the thing that I found was really interesting is like each individual node, right, is like a large, basically like a large, like, I don't know, like manufacturing piece, right? Like, and there's only two companies in the world that make that, like, that device. So it's like super centralized, right? So it's not just like Juri was saying for Bitcoin miners and for the ASIC machines that like we all love and need. It's beyond that, right? Like the centralization of this space. So having, Intel in the mix, whether it's like, the best in class machine or one class less than the best in class machine, like I think it's net good for Bitcoin miners. Also, when we think about purchasing machines, which is like not something that is talked about beyond secondary market, the primary market is like not that clear. You sign a contract, right? You agree to a price. Sometimes that price changes based on like market conditions. You don't have a lot of insight into like what's happening or what's going on or what other people are paying for. So the increase of more ASIC manufacturers will, I think, make the industry a little bit more mature. We've come a little bit of a way, right, from like a few years ago, with now you have contracts, right, that you are obligated to certain things. But I still think there's like a long way to go. So companies like Blockstream with buying Spondoolies and working on that, companies like Square getting into this, companies like Intel now backing, this industry itself is net good. Just because I think that it will increase like the professionalism of the space and allow for it to really turn into an industry that is like others with a little bit more transparency.
And that was a good point, Amanda. What Amanda mentioned with the big nodes is pretty much that the manufacturers of equipment that is used to make chips that is then sold to TSMC and Samsung and are not produced by them. They're produced, and I believe, Amanda, that it's European or Scandinavian companies, right? One or two that produces that very specialized equipment. And for me, it's, I start thinking, as we've all experienced the craziness of the world over the last 5 years, you do start to think, back to economics 101 and trading 101, where you're taught in school that specialization is good and trading is good. And if I am really, really good and efficient at making shoes, and Amanda is really, really good at making producing bananas, we're going to both specialize in what we're good at and then trade. And then in the end, we are both better off because we're going to more cheaply produce more shoes and more bananas, and we're both going to enjoy more abundant life after trade. But what some of those models did not take into account is the risk of us turning against each other and not trading with each other anymore. And I think we should examine some of these dependencies across the world. Like Amanda mentioned, energy. We have seen now that a lot of world is depending on Russia on energy, and you better make sure that your trading partner is your friend, because if you turn on them or they turn on you, you will need to find another way to procure whatever good you need. And in some cases, if it's a good that you can live without, or you can quickly substitute with something else, maybe it's not a big problem. But if we are talking about energy, or if we are talking about chips that go in pretty much every single thing that we need, then it's a problem. I mean, even if you try to, I don't know if I've tried to buy a car in the last year, and it's not very easy to buy a new car these days. So it's definitely going to impact a lot of areas of our life.
So I have some more questions that are kind of around decentralization, actually, that have popped up. First one is, Amanda, I saw that Galaxy has been putting out some research on the upgrade to the Stratum Protocol.
Yeah.
I would love for you to summarize what it is for our listeners, and then
that
talk
is a tough one.
I mean, it's basically like a messaging protocol, right? That miners.
Yeah, so I can give some like general background, right?
Okay.
But would need Rachel here to dive into like the real technical.
Yes, just some general background, and then if you want to, we can talk about maybe some of the downsides and better hash, which is a kind of alternative proposal to Stratum, which would mitigate some certain attack vectors that Stratum has.
Yeah, so better hash is folded into a lot of Stratum v2, as I understand it, which is great. I know, Maccarello really led the way with that, and I think it's really important. If we think about Bitcoin and what has happened with hash rate over the past 13 years, there was, Stratum v1 came out as a protocol when Bitcoin hash rate was really low, and we really needed a new upgraded protocol about 4 years ago. But we're still using Stratum v1. So I think that's like one thing that is we're far beyond the point of us needing something new. And I love that we're working on it, right? So Rachel, who's on the mining team, she dedicates a lot of her time to open source development, which is not really, I don't think, talked about, right? Galaxy does a lot of different things, but we also have a person dedicated to open source development on Bitcoin, which, is a fascinating topic to think about when you think about large companies, right? Now trying to think about what they need and how they can support the protocols. But Stratum v2 will allow for more flexibility for miners. So one thing that I think is really cool that doesn't exist today is right now when a block is assembled, that block is assembled by the pool versus the individual miner. So they select what transactions go inside the block. With Stratum v2, you would be able to select the transactions that go inside the block. And I think that that's something that's really cool and new. So over time, that could be used in good ways or bad ways. So, for example, if you are a large company, right, that say you're a custodian, that you want to be able to prioritize your clients' transactions over somebody else, you technically could do that in Stratum v2. And it's not against the rules, right? But it is something that we'll see, with all technology, when it continues to increase, good things and bad things might come out of it.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And that's cool. That was the main idea behind Better Hash, and so I didn't know that main idea was folded into Stratum v2. So there's this idea of centralization of choosing what transactions go into a block in a pool with Stratum v1, and historically speaking, all the transactions were chosen by one node that represented that pool, as far as I understand it. With v2, then the individual miners, so if I have a few ASICs and I happen to discover that block, then my node gets to decide with its block template which transactions go into the block. So that does decentralize that decision making a little bit, which is cool.
I also, one thing that's kind of interesting is there's a few people working on Stratum V2. So there's, the adoption that Slushpool has created where they individually put Stratum V2 on miners. And then there's this other body of work, and Rachel breaks this all down in the long blog post. There's, a group with BitMEX Square and Galaxy that are also working on Stratum V2, right? So I think one of the other pieces that I thought was kind of fascinating when you're thinking about protocol upgrades is just like the relationship between miners and devs and users. And that's, something that she breaks down. So I would encourage anyone interested in Stratum V2 to really take a look at it. She goes through all of the different pieces of it, which is like a really in-depth look of like the differences of Stratum V1 and V2 and like what V2 will do differently.
Yeah,
It's absolutely fantastic report, like almost every that Galaxy publishes. So if you know nothing about Stratum V2 and if you want to get a history lesson and deep technical and high level explanation, definitely read the report. I definitely learned a lot about it myself, and
Same.
I would just add to that. It does, from what I learned from the report itself, it does bring also some benefits on a technical level from its more efficient protocol that's more optimized for the large scale operations that we have today. It does bring some security benefits, and if we look at giving power to the users or individual miners to construct their own blocks, I think that's very positive thing, right? And it further goes along. It decentralizes further the power, however you define that power, which aspect of that power you look at the Bitcoin network. And certainly as the largest pool on the network, we know that we as a pool would also play a big part of putting Stratum V2 into mainstream or into production. And so we as Foundry it's very well aligned with our values around decentralization. So we would definitely be pushing it to any users that want to be constructing their own blocks or block templates. And obviously there's also reliance on firmware of manufacturers to adopt it. So there's another kind of component where you will need to see a push. What's the other thing that we're looking from a perspective of a pool operator in Stratum V2, there are certain things that we have to consider, certain dynamic that potentially changes when you do give a miner ability to construct their own block. And it is an edge case. It is a case, for example, let's say a miner is mining empty blocks, or let's say a miner themselves is not fully optimizing the transactions that are bringing the most revenue. Well, that revenue, at least in the FPPS pool, is the foregone revenue for the pool operator, right? And so if the pool operator is committing to pay certain amount of Bitcoin out to the miners, no matter what blocks are fine, you're definitely hurt if then the blocks that you do end up mining are not maximizing that revenue, right? So that's one example of a component that we would need to look into and find a solution to before fully adopting. But nonetheless, none of these issues are unsolvable, and I'm sure when the Stratum V2 is live that we would be making a big push for it.
One thing that we really, really wanted was Stratum V2 to be put on, like, if we firmware on an ASIC, right? Let's start there, is kind of interesting because it's closed sourced. So you don't really, you have to ask like the manufacturers for certain things, like if you want to update something, and then you also like completely give away your warranty, right, if it's a new machine. So one thing that would be really cool, and we've started these conversations, is like if we were to write Stratum V2 code that could work, can a manufacturer just like instantly put it on, right, the machine? So Stratum V2 is then on every single mining machine that you purchase, like now and in the future. And I think that would really like help with adoption. But there's no incentive for the manufacturers to really do that other than like users saying like, I want it. And I don't think that we're there yet with Stratum V2. So I think that it's a long way coming. I also think that if we're being realistic, we're probably like 2 to 3 years out of Stratum V2 like actually being operable.
This is what I love about Bitcoin devs. They take their time, get everything tested, and treat it like
And right.
nuclear power plant operating systems or something. So yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize that there's this separate protocol that's outside of the Bitcoin protocol that miners use to speak to each other, to broadcast the discovery of blocks in fractions of a second around the world, to minimize, orphaned blocks, et cetera. There's a whole nother world there that's really interesting to explore if you haven't yet, about how the Stratum Protocol and just how Bitcoin miners talk to each other and solve some of the problems that the Bitcoin protocol itself may have presented in the early days. I want to ask a quick question. I'm going to save a couple of these for the Spaces Q&A. But Amanda, you've spoken in the past about providing miners with financial derivatives, financial products and derivatives. I think you call it MiFi.
Yeah, so MiFi is like a very broad term. It's kind of like a little coy play on DeFi. Right. I can't say that I came up with that, though. Our president Chris came up with it. But miner finance is like broad, right? Like we do ASIC backed loans, we do Bitcoin backed loans, we do any type of loan that you need basically as a miner. We do not hash rate derivatives. We can do, Bitcoin based derivatives. We do credit facilities, credit lines, right? So I think one of the things that is really interesting for miners, especially the larger ones that are now, trying to figure out how they separate themselves out from other large miners, is having a really strong treasury management strategy. And up until this point, like miners really have focused a lot on building versus like thinking about, how do we think about how we use this Bitcoin that we produce like to our best advantage to continue to scale and grow. And so, Juri also, Foundry does miner finance and other products too, in collaboration with Genesis. But, I think that there is a lot of different things that miners need from a finance perspective. And we try to create these like really bespoke solutions. So we mine Bitcoin, right? I know what I would accept and what I wouldn't accept from like a financing company. So I try to really be like a miner friendly product creator, and think about like where a miner is in their stage of their process and like what they might need now, what they might need from a financing perspective in the future, and like really try to help them build solutions to help them scale and grow. So that's generally what MiFi is. It's not as well, I would say we don't rug pull people like DeFi does, but I guess I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. All right, we'll move over to Spaces. I know there's some people over there listening in, cool. And we'll do some Q&A. So if you are listening over on Spaces, get your mining questions ready for these two. It's a great opportunity to have your questions. I know mining is probably one of the least understood aspects of Bitcoin for a lot of newish Bitcoiners. And so get your mining questions ready, and we'll see you over there, Amanda and Juri.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, that ends the live video broadcast portion of the show. Again, we're going over to Twitter Spaces at Swan Bitcoin, or just look at the top of your Twitter app. If you're following Swan, you'll see it pop up there. Next week, we have a back-to-back week. We're not taking 2 weeks off on this one. So we have Austin Hill and Jeff Booth next week. Austin Hill is co-founder of Blockstream. He's on to something different. I won't say bigger and better. Blockstream is pretty hard to top. But Austin Hill, amazing Bitcoiner, tons of knowledge, tons of experience, along with Jeff Booth. That's going to be a great combination. Peter McCormick on What Bitcoin Did had these two on last month, and there's just so much more to the conversation to have that we wanted to have a follow-up. And then at the end of March, it's the end of Q1, so that means it's time for the quarterly report with Preston Pish and Andy Edstrom. Those are always super fun shows. That one's going to be on Wednesday, March 30th at 9 p.m. Eastern and 6 p.m. Pacific. It's a primetime show. It's always fun to do those at the end of the day. So join us for Austin Hill and Jeff Booth next week, and then Preston Pish and Andy Edstrom on Wednesday the 30th, the week before the big Bitcoin conference in Miami. If you have not bought a ticket yet, you need to really consider it. I know it's an expensive trip for a lot of people to fly down there, find a hotel room, pay for the ticket and all of that. 30,000 Bitcoiners are going to be there. It's going to be massive. Well, 30,000 people are going to be there. A lot of them will be Bitcoiners, and we're all going to hang out and meet each other in real life, get off of Twitter for a few days, And I've been to a couple of these now, and they've been instrumental parts of my Bitcoin experience and my Bitcoin career. So if you're thinking about trying to get into the Bitcoin space, especially with a job or a career move, then get down to Miami and be there and network and hang out. You will not regret it. It is a ton of fun right on the beach. It's going to be amazing. All right, I'm going to head over to Twitter Spaces and meet up with Amanda and Juri there and everybody hanging out there. This is the end of the video portion of the show. We'll see you over in Spaces.